What do the Kardashians and the Trumps have in common? Perhaps too much, according to our guest, cultural critic James Wolcott, who will be here to talk about 2 new books about both clans. Feeling a bit nostalgic for the fun part of the 80s? Tina Brown will be here to talk about her new book, The Vanity Fair Diaries. Plus, it's National Book Award Week. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world, and we'll talk about what we here at the Book Review are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. James Wolcott joins us now. He is a columnist at Vanity Fair, and this week he reviews 2 books together on our cover, Raising Trump by Ivana Trump and The Kardashians, an American Drama by Jerry Oppenheimer. Jim, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So this is a fun pairing. I think that you describe them, the word you use is clanships. What do they have in common?
Well, they're both extended families that are brands, and they're very self-consciously brands. The Trump brand, of course, was something that he could put on a building. And then, of course, then it was extended to steaks and casinos and this and that. The Kardashian brand, it originated out of the Gabor sisters. And the Gabor sisters made their names not by anything they particularly did, but by marrying very rich, prominent men.
Right.
And so Kris, before she was a Kardashian, she started out very early wanting to do that. The Kardashian name became a household name during the O.J. Simpson trial. Now, what's interesting is that there are a lot of names that became household names then, and then faded over time, and then were revived by the various docudramas.
Right.
But that name, first of all, Kardashian has a real sound to it. One of the things that's very funny about the Oppenheimer book is Bob Kardashian's attempts to turn each woman into a traditional Armenian housewife.
It didn't work out.
No. And in fact, before Kris, there was Priscilla, who had been married to Elvis Presley.
Mm-hmm.
He had a thing for her. Well, you were never going to turn the ex-wife of the king into a glorified housefrau in Beverly Hills. It just wasn't going to happen. And it didn't happen with Kris. As the book documents, he gave her all kinds of instruction tapes. Here's how you improve your mind. She's going to have to learn to economize and not spend money. Well, of course, she just went wild.
Mm-hmm.
And she's the one who really took the Kardashian name and then made it into a brand through the children.
So where did the money come from? Did she come from money? Was this money that Robert Kardashian made?
No, she did not come from money, but it was that the aspiration was to go for that, to follow that, to get out of the little humdrum world. When she was a teenager, she was involved with a golf pro. And then, she basically played Bob Kardashian very well. He didn't want to marry her. He was hesitant. And she played a waiting game. She did not come from money. But it was one of those things that once you've tasted it and once you've been in that world, and a lot of it has to do with the world you're moving in, you don't want to go back. Right. To the little bachelorette apartment.
So for those who have either forgotten the O.J. Simpson trial and drama or didn't watch the miniseries, refresh us on what her role was in that saga.
Well, her role was really just sort of subsidiary. The role was Bob Kardashian's because he was a lawyer and he was a friend of O.J. Simpson's. And during the infamous day of the Bronco chase, he read the statement to the press, and the press, of course, was in a frenzy at that point, and his name was on the screen, and that was the first time the Kardashian name went out.
Right.
Now, what the book says is that Kris herself was never crazy about O.J. because she knew that O.J. mistreated Nicole Simpson, to put it mildly. But she was willing later on to really trade on the Kardashian name. But it was really his story because he and his brother, they had been big buddies with O.J. They had a little kind of swinging pad. And Kardashian, the sad thing is, Bob, he thought, my loyalty is going to win the respect of people. Everyone else has turned on O.J. But instead, when the acquittal came down, he was considered part of you helped a killer go free.
So moving fast forwarding to the sort of resurgence of the Kardashians, which I think happened with the TV show, right?
Right.
So at that point, Bob Kardashian is pretty much out of the picture, and she is remarried to
Yes.
then Bruce Jenner.
Then Bruce Jenner. And yeah, Bob is like, he marries a couple times and they just don't work out. She marries Bruce Jenner, and then the second part of the, dynasty through him, Kim Kardashian, the young Kardashians were on the scene with the Hilton sisters. And of course, the Hilton sisters were just, huge at that time. And
what was that time? Where are we in the timeline of
are we
Kardashian history?
Yeah, I think we're let's see, early 2000s. It would have been early 2000s going up to the mid 2000s. And of course, what Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton share is this explosion of notoriety through a sex tape. And unlike in the past where that would have destroyed someone, and made them an outcast, this made them a bigger celebrity.
Jerry Oppenheimer, of course, has written many bestsellers, lots of unauthorized biographies of famous people. Like, what makes him stand out? Does he get access? Is it just going through, like, stuff that's already out there?
I think it's just going through the stuff that's already out there and synthesizing it. He talked to people who knew Chris back when and some longtime friends. They've so monetized their world that understandably their attitude is, why should we let some outsider come in and try to get stuff from us when, we have our own story to tell and we can tell it the way we want and repackage it the way we want. So with his other subjects, one of them was Anna Wintour. I don't imagine Anna Wintour said, "Welcome into my parlor."
Right. So this is very much an unauthorized.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, I think he probably puts on his racing stripes and says, all right, we're all, zoom we go through this set of live.
And is there anything, are there any revelations in there that like the most loyal Kardashian TV viewer wouldn't have known?
I don't think there's necessarily any bombshells, but what's interesting is if you're overwhelmed by the specifics of the whole saga, when you see...
If you can't get the Kourtneys,
Kourtney
straight from the Kendalls and the Kim.
Yeah. I mean, I get emails, daily emails from Teen Vogue, and they are reporting on all of this, but it's almost like the Martian Chronicles, because they'll say, Kendall furious because so-and-so dragged so-and-so's ex-girlfriend. Of course, drag doesn't mean... And it's like, wait a minute, who's this? Who's the ex? What? You have to... But of course, the people who follow it can... they totally put the pieces together. But what you see is the larger pattern of how celebrity gets made and how branding happens and how things that in the past would have been huge setbacks. One thing that I was interested in, and I sort of knew it piecemeal, but was the kind of looming shadow of Elvis Presley, because Bob Kardashian dated Priscilla, and then Linda Thompson was married to Bruce Jenner later. And so there was a whole thing of this connection with the king and the knack for branding, which is part the Hiltons, but it's also it's the kind of classic Andy Warhol. Because Andy Warhol's thing was, you're a superstar if I say you're a superstar.
Right. But here's the thing that people will sort of debate if they want to debate these kinds of things about the Kardashians and the Hiltons and perhaps the Trumps and the like, which is that you look at them and you say, well, this is not these aren't the sharpest tools in the box. They don't have any particular talents or intellect. The question then is it an accident that they are so successful? Or then is it, as people might say, well, look, obviously they were very smart. They knew exactly what they were doing. I don't know. Well, where do you come down on this?
Well, part of it is that the Kardashians particularly fell into the hands of very successful marketers and packagers. Ryan Seacrest, for example. They know how to take things. And in fact, they would then go on these reality shows and take people you never heard of for anything on different shows and then make them into celebrities. All of a sudden, Duck Dynasties and all. So they didn't do it alone. They hit a particular moment. And I think what really made it possible was the explosion in cable TV. When you had all these channels, they have all these hours to fill.
Right.
As many Kardashians as there are, we're going to run out of them. So we're going to dig up real housewives, who of course are fake housewives, but I mean, they're not, but real housewives of Los Angeles and real housewives in New York and so and then you create those little like warring, almost like Sicilian feuds within people who barely know each other. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that cable television had this insatiable need to create fake celebrities and fake conflict.
Well, let's go to a very different kind of conflict and switch over to Ivana Trump's Raising Trump. I think bearing in mind that we are in many ways still talking about the same thing. It's such a curious book. I mean, even from the cover, which has this really unflattering family photo on it, where you've got Donald Jr. looking very surly and Eric looking distracted. And it's not a flattering image of Ivana Trump. I think Ivanka maybe is the only one who sort of, comes across. Well, why did Ivana write this?
I think simply she wanted to ride in on the Trump wave, even though she's been out of, his life for a while.
Right, she's still the real first lady.
Yeah, real first lady, which of course none of them are particularly happy about it, nor should they be. I think she just wanted to sort of ride along, but she really miscalculated the mood and the time, because for most people, this is not a jolly family and this is not a jolly period. So giving us your recipes for Thanksgiving and all the fun things you did when on your skiing trips, that's really not going to go over now. Maybe she just didn't care. I mean, maybe she's just that, she's much more like a Gabor sister than Kris Kardashian.
In many ways.
Yeah, so she just may be blithe and like, what,
Did she take the opportunity to kind of write her own life story or have it written?
Yeah, no, she does tell her story, and growing up and coming from, Eastern Europe and the communist world and the crackdown in Prague. And so you can see, well, of course she would take to the West and the fun and the fashion and the money, being thrown around and not having people spying on you all the time. And she hit at the right time. She came to New York and, was immediately sort of taken up by Donald.
Right.
And so I think she just kind of rode in on the fun.
There's got to be a lot of anger there on her part. And this is the first time, right, that she's kind of writing about the whole Marla Maples episode.
Yes, well, but the anger seems totally directed at Marla Maples rather than Donald Trump, and
that's fascinating.
Yeah, because if you read other books about Donald Trump in that period, Donald Trump, it's not like, oh, poor Donald just didn't know what hit him when Marla came along. He was maneuvering Marla Maples and a friend of hers into the same ski resort in a different part of the ski resort where he was spending time with his family. So he was playing all kinds of things, but he kind of got caught up in it. I don't think he expected it to blow up on him.
Do you get a sense in this book of how her mind works such that she could completely absolve him of blame for this?
No, except the only thing I can figure is, and this isn't something she would address, is that maybe there's a non-disclosure agreement. I don't know if she'd still be getting alimony. No, she's awfully blithe. She talks about, the humiliation at the time and how hard it was. She seems in some ways more irked at Barbara Walters when she sat down with Barbara Walters, and Barbara Walters asked her about these things in ways that she found very upsetting. That whole conflict and dissolution was really played out through the tabloid wars. That's when the New York City tabloids really made a difference at Daily News and the Post. And one took Donald's side and the other took Ivana's side. So it was each day you had warring stories that kept it going. But her whole thing now is that her attitude is kind of, life is to be lived and enjoyed and da-da-da. And my kids have grown up great.
So nobody is under the illusion that Donald Trump was a hands-on father. I think he's been upfront about that. The kids have been upfront about that. So she really did raise these three original Trump offspring, Ivanka, Eric, and Donald Jr. So all these things that people are keen to attribute to Donald Trump's values or whatever probably are much more reflective of Ivana Trump as a parent.
There's one thing, I didn't have time in the piece to address it. but it's even more important now. She has a paragraph about how she disapproves of their hunting, the two young men, Donald Jr. and Eric. She disapproves of it. She knows why people get on their cases about it, but she phrases it in such a weirdly blithe way. She says, I don't see why anybody wants to travel to other countries to shoot Bambi and Dumbo.
Mm-hmm.
Well, today or in the last 24 hours, the Trump administration has rolled back restrictions on elephant trophies being imported into the U.S. And there are people who are saying, first of all, it's Trump reverses anything Obama did. But part of it is, of course, that Donald Jr. and Eric love to hunt. We've seen the photographs of them holding up, things they've sliced off the elephant. And it's horrific. And she devotes one paragraph to it as if she knows, I've got to say something about this.
Mm-hmm.
But she does not come down. And it is interesting, like, given that she was the one raising him, then where did that come from? Because there's no evidence that Donald Trump is golf. That's all we know about him. There's no evidence that he ever wanted to strap on, play Hemingway and go into the, the jungle and, do big game hunting. So where did that come from?
Where was she?
Where was she? And the other thing is, and I think I allude to it, is given that she came out of, communist era Czechoslovakia, does she have nothing to say about the Russian flirtations, which, well, they're more than flirtations. We now know, with each day, we know more about particularly Donald Jr.'s connections. So, I mean, it's very weird that she has nothing. And again, where did that come from? You're not going to find it here. And some psychohistorian's going to be able to have a field day someday trying to figure out, leaving aside Donald Trump, the two sons, and also Ivanka. Ivanka's a whole story.
This is a very interesting historical artifact, this book, if nothing else. All right, I could sit here and talk about this for a long time. I think your review has to be at least as fun to read as the two books, but I will leave that up to listeners and readers to decide. The books, again, are Raising Trump by Ivana Trump and The Kardashians, an American Drama by Jerry Oppenheimer, both reviewed by James Wolcott of Vanity Fair. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I am delighted to have here Tina Brown, whose new book is called The Vanity Fair Diaries, 1983 to 1992. Tina, thanks so much for being here.
Lovely to be here, Pamela.
So this book has an interesting backstory because it began as a memoir. How did that change?
It changed because when I started to read the diaries, which I was doing, as the basis of a memoir, I began to be very beguiled by the form itself because there was something about the onrushing, no idea where it's going, kind of quotidian chaos of a diary, in a sense, that is so sort of refreshing in a way because there's something, in a memoir, you're kind of repositioning yourself, really. You're using your later life to reflect on the early life. But doing it in the raw was so much more honest in a way. And there is something fun about one day you are saying, oh my God, being a working mother is so unbelievably tough. How do I, my husband's a workaholic, he's never there. What the heck, how am I supposed to do? And then the next day it's the fall of the Berlin Wall and one's glued to CNN. And it's a kind of it's the mix of all of that makes a diary really, I think, kind of compelling. And I ended up thinking, you know what, I wonder if I should tell the story in the now because the 80s was an extraordinary time, and I'm surfing through this with the wide eyes of a newcomer to the United States.
I mean, it's interesting, too, because the diary format kind of suits a book about journalism because you are constantly thinking day to day. Even when you're working on a monthly like Vanity Fair, it's like it's changing on a constant basis. So the format of a diary of kind of being constantly in the now in a way works when you're talking about journalism.
Well, it does. And also, it shows, in a sense, how much life and the life I was leading and the people I was meeting led to the stories in Vanity Fair. We were covering the world of money and power and the Reagan era and the 80s craziness. And I was right in the thick of it, living it. And so the people that I meet, the celebrities that I talk about, just the social world that I was in, and also the sadness of the daily life at the time, which also was very much something one became used to and hits you much more when you do it in diary form, namely the amount of funerals I used to go to for people I lost to AIDS, for beloved friends, colleagues, people we wrote about, people who were in the news, people who I worked with on a daily basis. It was a funeral, every few months. And I've forgotten that. And that's somehow more alive when you're writing it in the now, as opposed to saying, AIDS hit New York and then there would be a kind of peroration about that. This was far more, for me, vivid and poignant.
No, I have goosebumps listening to you because I remember there's a point in the diary where you first mention AIDS and it's sort of not totally understood yet. And you have this sense of what is to come.
Absolutely. I lost my New York correspondent to AIDS when I was at Tatler, which was the magazine I edited before Vanity Fair. And I didn't even know what it was. He called it Grid. And he sent me this postcard saying, your fashionable correspondent is dying of the fashionable disease.
Oh.
Which was one of the saddest things. And I'll always remember that. And I thought, what does he mean, And of course, I came to know what he meant in a very, very poignant way. So that sort of runs through the diary as the kind of one of the dark undercurrents of the 80s. And also a sense, because being a newcomer as an English person living in New York, hadn't lived in New York except for a month or two before, I really was the kind of Alice in Wonderland.
Right.
And a young woman who had not, ever encountered this kind of accelerated, higher octane, corporate. I mean, Condé Nast felt to me like General Motors. I mean, it was huge to me as opposed because I just edited a little magazine in London. So, being in the thrumming heart of the sort of glossy magazine empire of Condé Nast 350 Madison, it really was Alice in Wonderland for me. And that is all recorded in the now. And there is something fresh and fun about that, I think.
You set the stage with an introduction. You have this great conclusion, too. So it sort of bookended on either end a little bit about your growing up and about your early years. And I want to start with Tatler in a minute. And then you ended, obviously, as you're moving on to the New Yorker. But were you tempted at all when you were gathering the diaries and going through them to annotate them or to sort of go back and be like, well, obviously I know now, or, to somehow kind of amend it?
Sometimes, but I have found ways to contextualize at times and ways to add understanding. Obviously, there were times when I did want to think, wait a minute, I'd love to now reflect on where this all went. But I tried to stay true to my chosen form. Once I'd chosen to go this route, I thought, okay, I've chosen to go this route. Now I'm not going to do a sort of half hybrid thing of a sort of half memoir. I didn't want to do that, actually. I did consider that. I did consider at one point doing prose to a text diary and then dropping in extracts. And then somehow the notion of creating the narrative out of the diary itself just seemed to me more refreshing as a sort of literary experiment for me. And that's what I went with.
So I was talking to one of your former colleagues last week, and he was marveling at the fact that you kept this diary. And did you keep it every single day?
I wrote a lot in those days. For a start, it was 1984 to 1992 or 3. And, there was the pre-digital age, so we weren't as distracted and as crazy busy as we are today.
TV wasn't nearly as good.
TV wasn't nearly as good. My husband was working in Washington for the first 2 or 3 years. I didn't have children till 2 years in. So for the first 2 years particularly, I was really, I'd come back, no one to talk to. My parents weren't even living there. I was kind of alone in this apartment and I would just want to unload. And by the way, writing a diary, it's not just a sort of literary, I must write my diary. It's really quite a need. I mean, if you are a diarist, it's a way of unloading, a way of clearing your mind. I mean, frequently I would find myself much calmer after writing it. That the thoughts would be tumbling, the reactions to the world were tumbling. And then once I'd written it down, I sort of knew what I thought.
Are you a lifelong diarist? Did you keep a diary as a child?
Yes, I always did keep a diary from about the age of 10. And every so often I still do. I don't write it nearly like I used to. I mean, sometimes I'll go for like 6 months without writing the diary, which is a bit of a shame. I do it now on the computer. And actually I'm beginning to wonder whether that's an inhibition in a way from writing it. Because although it's in some ways easier and clearer, and certainly to read back it's a lot clearer, there is something about the intimacy of that book and you.
Right.
And the portability of it. And the fact that you can
the slowness, too, that there's time for a little bit of reflection because you're held
Yeah,
back
it's very intimate, a diary. And I might decide to go back to doing it, to doing the written diary as opposed to the, on the laptop when I'm flying, which is really when I do it now. It's like if it's a long journey, if I'm flying to India or, I'm flying to London, I think, okay, I'll take the laptop and I'll sort of catch up. Never the same.
I mean, the other impressive thing about the fact that you kept a diary is that you weren't exactly leading a life of leisure at this time. You had this enormously demanding job and you were out, many nights and not too far into it, you have first one child and then another, a full-time working husband. Like how... It's just amazing, but you stayed committed to fairly regularly writing it all down.
Yeah, it was a need. I think, frankly, I'm a sort of born reporter, so I often, sometimes felt that a day unrecorded was a day half asleep, in a way, that unless you were recording it somehow, you were not fulfilling your obligation to be a really engaged person. And my engagement, as it were, with the material around me, the life around me, is very much one of a writer. I think, I need to describe it. I want to describe it. I want to think about it. I want to explain it to myself. And sometimes it justifies what I'm doing. Like, frequently I would go and think, I don't really want to go tonight, but it's great to see it. I want to be there to see it. And I'm glad I did. I mean, there were times when when I first met Michael Jackson, for instance, I feel it was kind of epic to meet Michael Jackson. And I think that anything I would have remembered later, I might have remembered a couple of details, but I wouldn't have remembered the kind of loping walk, the stooped shoulders, the fact that he was much taller than one expected, the fact that he had this wafy voice, but at the same time came up with kind of rather shrewd insights. The fact
that he'd kept a diary.
If only he'd kept a diary, can you imagine?
That I would read too. Let's set the stage in 1983. So you were the editor of Tatler. You became the editor, the youngest aged editor of not only Tatler, but practically anything in London, right? You were 26?
I was 25, actually.
25.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was 25 years old. And, it was one of those kind of happenstance things. I mean, the Tatler at the time, let's face it, was a tiny little shiny sheet that had a wonderful pedigree. It was a kind of old magazine that had been launched in 270 years ago. And in fact, it had a sort of Regency past, actually, in which it was started as a kind of intellectual shiny sheet at the time of Gulliver's Travels, And then it became later in the 30s a sort of Downton Abbey party handbook thing with black and white pictures of debutantes enjoying savoury, with a young Deb's Delight. And then it kind of went into the doldrums, but it kind of lurched out as a monthly, with advertisements for, small manor house in Derbyshire. And it was bought by this Australian real estate guy who fancied getting into media, as they so often do, witness Jared Kushner a few years later. And so he bought the magazine and said, I'm going to turn this into a glossy that competes with Vogue and Harper's and Queen, which were the two big British glossies at the time. And nobody wanted to do it. I mean, apparently he went around town asking proper editors to edit this thing. And I had been writing as a sort of young spark, for Punch and for the style pages of various publications. And Nigel Dempster, who was then the gossip columnist of the Daily Mail, had seen my stuff and he liked it. And he told the owner, this guy, Gary Bogard, why don't you go young? You're never going to get anybody real to do this. Just hire a young spark.
Real.
Yeah, hire a young spark. At least you can take a bet on youth, And he did. I mean, Nigel told him to call me. He did. And actually, I'd never thought of editing, actually, before that. But I had produced plays, and I understood how exciting it was. And I was also kind of frustrated about not getting the assignments that I wanted to get as a writer. I was always given, as women are or certainly were, the fluff stuff to do, And I was sort of vexed at the assignments I was getting. And I thought, this would be my playpen.
And you succeeded in that playpen. How did you get from there then to Vanity Fair?
Well, after 3 years of Tatler, we had gone from 10,000 circulation to 100,000, and it was considered a kind of happening and hot glossy. We had the best social story in the time, of course, which was Princess Diana's, The Rise of Princess Diana, which Tatler owned and did very well with. And we were bought by Condé Nast magazines. Cy Newhouse, the late lamented, he'd only died in September of this year to my sorrow. He had the British company, and he decided that this first interesting glossy that he'd seen, a new one, was Tatler. So he came to London and he bought it. And I was therefore in Condé Nast at that point. They moved us into the grand, Vogue house in Hanover Square. We were suddenly no longer the little maverick thing. We were part of this empire of Vogue and House and Garden and all the other magazines that they had. And so that brought me into the sort of the Condé Nast hemisphere. Then about a year or so in, I was getting sick of it. I found it kind of rather staid in its new management. And I kept hearing these sort of distant drums of the American company in New York relaunching Vanity Fair, which was the great iconic magazine of the 20s and 30s, and how Condé Nast was bringing back Vanity Fair from the dead, and it was going to be this huge, glamorous, fabulous thing. And, it piqued my interest. And they launched it in 1983. It was a turkey. I mean, It was one of those famously horrible turkeys because there was too much hype, too much money, too much sort of surround sound. And the first 2 editors bombed. And at that point, as so often happens with women who get the job when it's all been screwed up.
Right, it's a turnaround assignment.
Yeah, it was a turnaround assignment. And I think that Cy Newhouse thought, well, let's just try this girl in London. I mean, she's a fresh face. We're out of ideas here. So that's how I got Vanity Fair.
How different was the magazine scene in New York from the scene in London?
Well, very different. I mean, London, because it is such a small, ultimately, market and national, what happens in London is what happens everywhere. Everybody knew each other. It's a very kind of Fleet Streety, Grub Streety world at that time. The world of big media in New York was a far higher stakes, much more competitive, big time shark pool, if you like. And, of course, my world was mostly inside the court of Condé Nast, which at that time was sort of the court of Louis XIV.
Right. I mean, this is the heyday of magazines.
The heyday. Cy Newhouse was at the beginning of what became a sort of wonderful expansion tour where he kept launching new things and buying new things. He himself only took it over when he was 57 from his father, who had, made the fortune. And the baron of it all was this wonderful character, Alexander Lieberman, who was the editorial director. He was known as the Tsar of all the Russias because he was a Russian emigre, an artist of some repute, who was the editorial creative director of Condé Nast, all-powerful, big influence on Cy. And so I had these 2 people in my life, Cy, who was the owner, who was quirky, mercurial, demanding, but very supportive, and Alex, who was the sort of tricky, slightly conspiratorial, needing a lot of stroking and handling figure who was the editorial director of Condé Nast, who I became, in the end, incredibly fond of because he was a sort of a genius, and he taught me so much about magazines. I mean, he really did. It was like being an artist with finding that, Van Gogh was in the attic. You could call him at any time and he would come down if you wanted him to, which I always did. Some didn't. Some of the editors hated him. And, he would say, my dear, where's the glory in the magazine? He would say, my dear, this is vulgar. My dear, this is why? Why, my dear, why are you doing this? And I used to love the way he would make me question what I was doing. And, he would encourage me to be bigger and more thoughtful and more exciting in visually. And he taught me a great deal. So I was very, very lucky to have him as a mentor.
One of the things that I think won't surprise readers about this book is that it's total catnip if you're interested in magazines, if you're interested in journalism, if you're interested in the media in any way. There's a lot of that in here, but it's also really the portrait of an era of the 1980s, which is kind of having this moment. I'm watching Stranger Things 2, which is very 1980s, very different kind of 1980s. There's the play that just opened at Lincoln Center, Junk, about that whole junk bond era on Wall Street. And so much of that is captured in your book. You mentioned, of course, the AIDS crisis, many things that kind of set the stage for what's going on now in terms of the money and finance, and also our current President Trump, flits in and out of the narrative. I mean, that was just amazing.
I know. Well, it was a time of this kind of shiny surfaces and celebration of materialism. Madonna's Material Girl was the big hit song. Miami Vice with its pastel suits and its fast cars and its sense of sort of MTV video cuts and so on. It was all of that fast stuff. And also these money people, as you rightly said. I mean, characters like the financier Carl Icahn or Michael Milken, Ivan Boesky. I mean, these were the great sort of figures at the time who crashed and boomed around us. One minute they were making giant fortunes, the next thing they were being indicted. Trump himself was the sort of iconic figure, and Trump Tower itself. I argue in the book that it wasn't a person who was defining of the era. It was that gold building, that flashing gold building, Trump Tower.
I think the first scene, I might be mistaken, but I think the first scene that he's in the book is this great one where you see him, I think, at a dinner party, and you were seated next to him, and he talks about the fact that he was on the cover of Newsweek, and he's asking you, like, that's as good as Time magazine, right, Tina? It's good.
Right.
It's good.
And I teased him and I said, no, actually Time magazine's better than Newsweek. Because, but I was offered Time too. I was definitely offered Time too, which was like, no, I wasn't. And he said, I just booked Fawn Hall to appear at Trump Tower, right? Can't sing, can't dance, but she's $25,000. It's worth it. Everybody will come, right? And then he goes on about, I had to go to the opera last night. Ivana said, it's 2.5 hours, no break. I mean, I said to Ivana, like, what? Are you crazy? And, and actually, he was enjoyable. I mean, I found him funny and fresh and brash and, and unpompous and authentic, that word that we've now come to dread. But he was at that time,
Right.
He was a lot of fun. But he definitely congeals as the book goes on, because as the diaries continue, he becomes less and less appealing and entertaining. And we start to assign pieces about his financial troubles, his bankruptcy, his fake sort of whole position in the world. Anna Marie Brenner did an absolutely killer piece in the magazine where she also described how he had the speeches of Hitler on his desk, which made the most amazing news, as you can imagine. It was huge news on all the shows, and he went absolutely ballistic. And 6 months later, I describe in the diary how Marie Brenner calls me and says, oh my God, I was at a dinner last night, a black tie dinner, a benefit after Barbara Streisand's movie, Prince of Tides. And she said, I was sitting there having dinner and suddenly I felt something cold and wet down my back. I turned around. I thought the waiter had spilled a drink. And there was Donald Trump making his way off across the room. He'd thrown wine down my back. And this is what he did. It was like a sneaky assault on our journalist, because he was so mad with what she'd written. But it was kind of indicative, I guess, of what was to come.
You write in a very unfiltered way, because, of course, it's a diary about a lot of, well-known people from that time. Did you have any kind of, like, second thoughts, like, well, should I actually include that?
Well, obviously there were judgments, and there were things that were omitted, as you can imagine. I really have tried in the book, and I think I've succeeded. And I've never been invasive about people's private lives. Many of the people, of course, I write about, like the Reagans and the great sort of social walker at the time, as he was known, Jerome Zipkin, who was such a character, and Cy Newhouse, of course, himself, and Alexander Liebman. Many of them are no longer with us. But I also felt that I had to be honest about the time and what I felt at the time. And the descriptions of those events, those parties, which were always very wry in the diaries, they're not going to please everybody. But I also tend to feel, look, it's the 80s. It is what it is.
Yeah.
If you can't live with who you were, it has to be. I had to be honest. And I didn't want to put the gloves on and pretend that it was different.
I feel like everyone has to read this book just for your excellent use of adjectives in your physical descriptions of people. But it's not just personal about all of these public figures, but also about you. It's a love story between you and Harry Evans. You write about your kids, particularly your son, and challenges there.
Well, yeah, that is
the
other big thread in the book is the push-pull of ambition versus the desire to be a loving wife, mother, that whole juggle that every woman does. And also some of the agonies that I went through because my son was premature and developed and has Asperger's syndrome, which didn't have a label in those days. So there's a lot of there's something not quite right here, and it worries me. I could see that my son, who is a wonderfully funny and smart and delicious baby in the book, at the same time, there are worrying things that I know I must be concerned about.
Yeah.
And only at the end do I realize and learn that it's this thing called Asperger's. And I only learned that because Oliver Sacks, the great writer and doctor, submitted a piece to The New Yorker, actually, in which he describes Temple's Grandisman, the famous Asperger subject that he writes about. And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, some of the things that Temple Grandisman has, that is exactly what I'm seeing in George. And that's how I became to know that Georgie did have Asperger's. But so a lot of that is there in the book, that anxiety, and my sense of my father, who, I adored, who was a movie producer, but also fell on financial difficulties, and that stuff is in the book. Funny enough,
some of the sandwich generation thing going on there.
And one of the things that's funny, when you write a book like this, one of the big taboos right now is writing about money, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people don't ever want to talk about money. They'd rather talk about their sex lives than what they earn. But I decided to put in our stuff about money, about, wanting more money, not feeling I had all the money in the world.
It's very refreshing.
And, I wanted to talk about trying to get a raise and how do I get one, and then bringing in an agent who then gets me a wonderful deal. And I thought, do I write down here what the deal was? And I thought, you know what? Yes, because women want to know how to do that stuff. Because I actually, so often, oddly, I hate to generalize, but, sometimes women are very sort of reticent about that. They don't feel they're good at it. And I wasn't good at it at all. So I had to have an agent come in and do it for me. And I was very underpaid, but I kept being unwilling to raise it, and I think
you didn't want to rock the boat.
I didn't want to rock the boat,
yeah.
and felt it kind of wasn't my due. I do actually think, though, that when I look back at the magazine, I mean, this book is really a love affair about a career, it really was. And I wanted also to do that for young women today, because I feel there's so much surround sound about, we've got to all lean in, we've got to do, but actually just is about just loving your job as well.
Yeah.
I loved my job. I loved putting out magazines. The joy of collaboration is something that I think is sometimes underappreciated. Working in a team, it's like a school play. What's more fun than a school play? Same thing with a magazine. Rushing towards the publication, with 25 people who just are all working on the same thing to the same goal. There's nothing more satisfying. And being an editor who can assign stories, who can engage with the world, who can do a piece that makes somebody, promotes a wonderful book that didn't have attention or exposes a villain who ought to be brought down. These things are very gratifying. And it was a wonderful time, and I was allowed to do it, which very few people can now, really, with the new economics of magazines.
It's also rare to find women openly enthusing and being openly ambitious about the workplace. It's just not talked about. I think there is still a reticence. And it's interesting, too, to that you acknowledge all of these various tugs in the book, because from the outside at the time, of course, it looked like you were just carrying this off, with no problem whatsoever.
Succeeding with anything is a daily, hourly, incremental battle. And I think this book does sort of celebrate the joy of the strive, but it also, I think, illuminates the hardness of doing it, the hourly, the knockbacks and the frustrations, and the sense that you're not getting it right, and the people who don't understand, and trying to make people realize what you're doing, and they don't understand what you're doing, and they don't like what you're doing, and all of that was it was real and it was raw.
And yet there's a lot of triumph in the book. And one of the things that's tough in a way to read about now is that we're in a very different media environment and so much more challenging, especially for magazines.
Right.
And you are writing about triumphs that in a way you can't even have anymore. Like a lot of what you talk about in the book in terms of the actual work, which I love that you write so much about that, was the idea of the editor as a curator. And in a digital era, that role has been largely stripped away. What was it like looking back and seeing how very different that time was?
I feel it was much better, obviously.
Yes.
I'm not a big fan of algorithms just abrogating judgment, taste, and integrity, quite frankly. We see what's been happening at Facebook when that happens with, all kinds of stuff getting posted because there isn't any human intervention which says this doesn't look right to me. So it was wonderful to be an editor then and to feel that there were things to aspire to. I was surrounded by very good editors at the time. There was Jan Wenner was working at Rolling Stone, and Ed Kozner was a terrific editor working at New York Magazine, and Abe Rosenthal at the New York Times. And there were many giants. Ray Cave was the editor of Time. He was fantastic. Pat Ryan at People. These were really big people. Mm-hmm. And, at the time, to be the editor of Time or Newsweek was to be a demigod. People, to be an important editor like that had real respect. And now I feel that editors are kind of beleaguered figures who are on the run every day. Thank God for the New York Times.
I wouldn't know anything about that.
And, we are having to assert all the time why we mean something, right? And why we are important. And every editor now has to get out there and promote on television, like the whole idea, not just of his own publication or his own story, but why there's a point to the profession at all, which is really very, very unsettling.
So this book, as I said earlier, is prescient in so many ways. But one thing that you surely could not have known was that the longtime current editor of Vanity Fair would be stepping down just as your book is coming out, and people are really thinking about Vanity Fair and its place in the media and the cultural landscape and what is the future. And so I have to ask, if you were the incoming editor of Vanity Fair today, like, what would your objective be? What would your approach be? How would it be different?
Well, the stories have never been better. I mean, I would say you really have to, as the editor of a monthly, think about the 3 months from now. You cannot be caught up in the now of it. You have to be so alert to the start of a story and where it's actually going to go. And that's a different sort of skill set to just simply responding. It's not about responding. It is about predicting. And I think you can be successful in that by having that genuine curiosity when a story starts to bubble. I mean, I can think of so many stories now that I would assign that I know were just going to pop, sort of 3 months from now. That's what you have to do. But I also think that the most important thing, as I would say, is just don't get distracted by the noise, because you can make tremendous news and you can make tremendous impact. And I mean, the New Yorker is a weekly, but look what the New Yorker has been able to achieve with the Ronan Farrow story. That was not about following a story. That's about breaking a story and keeping your nerve to the bitter end and rounding it out. A magazine must really illuminate a world when it does a piece. It's not enough just to tell what happened. You have to tell what really happened and everything that was making the reason for it happening. That wonderful sort of deep context and I think people, the more they are attached to their screens, the more they're longing to know, to go deep, actually. There is, in fact, a longing for enrichment. I think there's a huge challenge.
Faith in books.
That is why I do too. It's about books and it's about narrative.
All right. Well, spoken by someone who knows. Tina, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela Poole.
The book, again, is The Vanity Fair Diaries, 1983 to 1992 by Tina Brown. Alexander Alder joins us now to talk about what's going on in the literary world. I think we're both a little bit sleepy from last night's National Book Awards.
Yes,
but let's talk
it's
about
one
it.
of the latest nights out of the year for me, routinely.
This is how exciting we are, us book people. We're usually in bed at the 10 o'clock hour.
Right. It was a fun National Book Awards. I mean, they call it the Oscars of the publishing world usually.
I call it the Dork Oscars.
The Dork Oscars is perfect. And this year was more like the real Oscars a little bit, because Cynthia Nixon, the actress, was hosting the ceremony, and Anne Hathaway presented a Lifetime Achievement Award to Annie Proulx. It was a little glitzier, I felt.
Yes. Well, and we had Bill Clinton, of course, presenting the Literarian Award to Dick Robinson, the president of Scholastic.
That's right.
I feel like say Literarian 3 times fast.
That's difficult.
That's
yes.
a tongue twister. And then not on stage, but in the audience, interestingly, was Emma Roberts.
Oh, is she writing a book?
No, she runs a book club.
Oh, perfect.
Yes. It's funny because another glamorous event this week was the Glamorous Women of the Year Awards.
Yes.
And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie was one of the presenters, and she was really greeted on stage like a true rock star.
Like a celebrity.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is fun to know that that outside the book world, acclaimed novelists are viewed as exciting.
Yes, exactly.
But let's talk about the winners.
The winners, I have to say, I wasn't too surprised by any of them. There were amazing finalists this year, and it was a great year for women among the finalists. Really, women dominated this year. In the fiction category, 4 out of 5 of the finalists were women. And the winner of the fiction category this year was Jesmyn Ward, who won for her novel Sing Unburied Sing, which was absolutely, one of, I think, every critic's top books of the year, it seems like at this point. But there was a question in my mind as to whether she would win simply because she won so recently for Salvage the Bones. She won in 2011 the Fiction Award. So often you don't see repeat winners in such close proximity.
And the other finalists were Elliot Ackerman, Lisa Ko for The Leavers, Min Jin Lee for Pachinko, and
And Carmen
Maria Machado.
Exactly. So it was a really great group of fiction finalists, but I still sort of had the suspicion that Jesmyn Ward might win just because her book has gotten so much critical love. She's having quite a year. She won a MacArthur Genius Grant as well, and it seems like her career is really just rising, and she's getting more and more exposure. So this will certainly help to have a second National Book Award. And in the nonfiction category, I also had a suspicion, and I don't usually take credit for guessing in advance, although maybe next year I should make my predictions so that people can hold me accountable. I'll make them the week before in the podcast, and then there'll be a public record.
But what if you're not lucky next year?
Exactly. Next year could be the time I miss. But I was suspecting that Masha Gessen might win in the nonfiction category. She won for her book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. And it was interesting to hear her talk. It sounds like the book really evolved while she was writing it. She was planning on this kind of quick, short nonfiction book about totalitarianism in Russia. And it turned into this more of an epic that told the story of how Russia has devolved back into an authoritarian country under Vladimir Putin through the lives of these 4 young Russians, or not young anymore, but Russians who were born in the 1980s when it seemed like the country was tilting towards democracy. And so she sort of followed their lives to tell the story. And she was very, I think, genuinely surprised to win, though. She said she didn't prepare a speech, and she noted that she never thought a book about Russia would be on the long list or the short list even, much less be the winner of the National Book Award. And then she kind of dryly noted, but things have changed.
She's a very charismatic speaker, so she did not need to prepare a speech.
She was sort of obviously alluding to the Russian interference in our elections and how much it's becoming part of kind of American consciousness right now. And, like you said, she's a charismatic speaker, and I see her all the time on various news channels. She's become kind of the go-to Russia expert. So that was great to see her get recognized also, for this long-form piece that she did. And in the category for young people's literature, which was another exciting category this year, the winner was Robin Benway for her novel, Far from the Tree. This is a young adult novel, and I haven't read it, I confess, but I want to from reading the descriptions. It sounds like a great book.
It was reviewed in this past weekend's issue of the Book Review. Got a very positive review. I know it's a favorite of Maria Russo, our children's books editor. It should be noted that it is different from Andrew Solomon's book of the same title, which also had a young person's
That's what I was
version of it
initially
this year.
by.
Yes.
Andrew Solomon did a young adult version of his book, Far from the Tree. So
one of the interesting things about the National Book Awards Young People's Literature category is that it traverses both the middle grade and YA age groups. So there are a lot of books that could be possible contenders, but it's leaned a little bit towards the YA in recent years.
Yeah, and when the judges were often kind of explaining their criteria, and in this case, they said they wanted a book that could stand the test of time, that would be a classic, that really succeeded on an artistic level. And so I think those more ambitious sort of novels tend to be in the YA category for slightly older readers, although there is a ton of amazing middle grade literature.
There really is.
And plenty of middle grade authors have won the National Book Award.
They should expand it.
Yeah, bring in picture books. I'd love to see that.
All right, let's give a last word to the poetry winner. Who is the winner for poetry this year?
So I will have to say that our colleague Greg Coles did call the poetry winner. He said he was pretty sure it would be Frank Bedart for Half Lake Collected Poems, 1965 to 2016. He's such a well-known poet. This collection is, really, I think, encompasses his whole body of work. So it's almost like a Lifetime Achievement Award in the poetry category. And he gave a lovely acceptance speech.
All right. Well, congratulations to all the winners. Alexandra and I will get better sleep tonight.
That's right.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks, Pamela.
My colleagues John Williams, Greg Coles, and Jen Salai join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right. So, John, you show off. You're reading a book that's very much of the moment.
Yeah, I went to the National Book Award ceremony last night with several people, including yourself, and I had a sense that Jesmyn Ward would be one of the favorites for the fiction award for her novel Sing Unburied Sing, her second novel to win the prize. She ended up winning it. And so I had started reading it sort of in advance of going, just so that I had a horse in the race. And I'm nearly finished, and a few quibbles aside, I really like it a lot. I find it deeply moving. It's about this young boy who goes with his mother to get his father out of jail in the South. And it's basically about their road trip. And the mother is addicted to meth, and the boy has a younger sister who's very young. She's sort of a toddler, and he takes care of her while they're on the road. And the book switches perspectives chapters are told from different characters' perspectives, but I feel like the book is really the boy's book. The feeling of the book is from this 13-year-old boy's perspective, and he's just a very warm character who you really feel for because he's, his grandparents on his mother's side love him, but he's just very alone, and he's a very loving kid, even though he has all this trouble around him. And so I think that's what will linger from reading the book for me. And I just think that Ward is really impressive, still very young, even though she's now a 2-time National Book Award winner. So it'll be really interesting to see what she does next.
I'm curious, because last week I talked about Jacqueline Woodson's book, Another Brooklyn, which was also written from kind of that coming-of-age narrative, the adolescent point of view.
She actually announced the award last night. So Woodson announced Ward as the winner.
Yeah, it's funny.
And we also have the initials J and W in common.
Oh, yeah.
With John Williams. Yes.
Whoa.
Sorry, just to throw that
an
out
Illuminati
there.
thing going on here.
Jacqueline Woodson also read from Another Brooklyn at a Brooklyn Book Festival event that I introduced, moderated, except there was really no moderating going on. It was just a reading. And I asked at that event what she'd been reading lately, and she said, I was a judge for the National Book Awards. I've read 300 novels this year, and my eyes are bleeding, and I haven't been reading anything else lately. So
she obviously liked it. I think she said in the speech that there was the usual debate, but by the end they sort of all agreed that the award was worthy.
Well, so my question is there any sense that this book could read as a young adult fiction because of the 13-year-old perspective?
I don't think so.
No, I mean, no. It's I mean, a very, very smart young teenager I think could read it. It's not particularly there's no violence and the language isn't very, but no, it's definitely an adult book.
Yeah,
I think it's pitched mostly to adults. What are you reading, Greg?
I'm reading a novel called Autumn by Ali Smith, the British writer. It's funny because it's the second book called Autumn that I've read this year, and both books are the start of a quartet based on the season. So Ali Smith has Autumn, and we'll move on to winter, and then spring, and then summer. That's exactly what Karl Ove Knausgaard did with his book Autumn. His is nonfiction. It's pitched as nonfiction, and they're kind of mini contemplative essays. This book, Ali Smith's Autumn, is pitched as fiction, but it's also sort of mini contemplative essays, all filtered through the consciousness of the main, so far anyway, of the main character, Elizabeth, who seems to be based, kind of a stand-in for Ali Smith herself. It's really more about kind of mood and voice and the consciousness that you're getting to the extent that it is filtering its protagonist's consciousness, and that's the story that you're getting. It put me in mind a little bit of Rachel Cusk's recent books, Outline and Transit, this kind of series that she's working on that also is all about just giving you this one person's perspective. So it's a book that is as much about mood and observation as it is about actual story so far.
Yeah,
anyway.
No, I read it earlier this year. That's going to continue.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not like a narrative propulsive book. It's very, it's
very
and
beautiful
poetic.
too.
Oh yeah, no, she's a really good writer. She's also doing this very quickly. Winter is
coming.
It is
Winter
is coming. Winter is coming.
Nice.
Jen, what's in front of you there?
Well, so I've got 2 books here, one of which I had talked about a bit last week, which is called New World by William Finnegan. And now I'm on the section, as I mentioned last week, this was written about 20 years ago, and he went through the country and basically for 6 years immersed himself in the lives of people in different parts of the country to see how they were faring in a place where the economy, even though it seemed to be booming nationwide, was actually contracting for a lot of people. And so now he's in San Augustine, Texas, in Far East Texas, which is a place that he says is actually more like the Deep South than it is like Texas per se. And so he is in a community there where the decades of industrial prosperity that certainly took place in New Haven, which is where the first part of the book takes place, really passed this town by. So he's looking at how people there cope with the lack of jobs and also drugs. I mean, that's something that appeared in the first part of the book, and it's appearing again here in a different way because this is also the borderland. And then another book that I started, which is very different, but it's also not a contemporary book. This one was written in 1918, and it's by
1918?
1918.
Not contemporary.
Not contemporary. And it's by the Japanese writer Junichiro Tanizaki, and it's called Devils in Daylight. And it's a short novella, very suspenseful. It basically starts off with a guy. It's narrated by this guy who's a writer, and he says that one of his friends, whom he doesn't seem to like very much and who he suspects is actually quite crazy, calls him up to say that he wants the narrator to come meet him because he knows that there's a murder that's going to take place, but he doesn't exactly know the details. He just knows that it's going to happen. So the book seems to be about not just about this murder and this possible crime, but also about notions of sanity. And also, of course, at the beginning, the narrator is a little bit worried that he himself might be the victim.
Sounds like the start of a Hitchcock movie.
Yes. And one of the things that the narrator says about this friend of his is that the friend is this sort of wealthy heir, and that he's been corrupted by crime novels and moving pictures. So
it's an old book. Is it a new translation?
So it is a new translation. New Directions, I think, came out with this maybe about a year ago. And I'm not sure if it was ever translated before into English. So it might be new in that regard too. Pamela?
Well, speaking of translations, I finished Leo Tolstoy's Haji Marat, which was in a newly translated edition. And so not entirely unrelated, I'm now reading a book by Elif Batuman, her first novel, The Idiot. But of course, her previous book was The Possessed, which was about, I think the subtitle was Adventures in Russian Literature, because she does speak Russian, even though she is Turkish by birth and is clearly a fan of Russian literature. But this is not about Russia, although indirectly, it's really about Harvard class of 1995, I think probably largely autobiographical, and about that particular period. I think I've mentioned before in the podcast, I am disturbed about the fact that any time that I have lived through is now considered a historical period. And especially as we get into the 90s, which to me was yesterday.
Yeah.
But when you read this book, you really do enter into that time zone, and you realize, wow, it really was different. I remember when I went to college at roughly the same period, although not to Harvard, but everyone had those Macs, those very colorful Macs. What were they called? iMacs? They came in orange,
tangerine,
turquoise,
all the
right?
Apple phrases for the colors.
Yes, wow, you actually remember the and I did not have one of those computers. I felt a lot of seething envy for those who did, but she's actually a little younger, and so email is a thing, and it's a large part of this novel because it's about sort of how you deal with this new form of communication. And email did exist when I was in college, but it wasn't used by normal people. So I think I've mentioned this too, that there was, I remember my senior year, I was dating a guy, and we were walking by the computer sciences building, which is a building that I never entered during my entire period in college. And he said that he was taking a sort of weird English class in which they were doing something involving what he called hypertext. And I was like, that's it. It's over between us. I don't want to know about that. And we did break up shortly thereafter. It wasn't
He is now
unrelated.
worth $3.5 billion.
That's right.
I hope he's doing well.
Much better. Elif is incredibly funny, and it's just a sharply observant novel, really witty. It's clever without going into twee territory, which is not a place I enjoy. And it's one of those books that you want to read every other passage aloud to whoever's next to you. I did an event with her earlier this year where it was kind of a performance that she did, and she told a story about a squirrel getting into her apartment. And you would think I don't know, how much could you make out of that particular scenario? But she really worked it. It was super funny. And it was interesting too, because really, what do you do when a squirrel gets into your apartment? Turns out there's not a lot you can do. And she called the emergency, animal services or whatever the agency is that's tasked with this. And they were basically you should leave and close the windows.
It's the squirrel's
and whatever.
apartment now.
Yeah, and you just kind of have to wait for like the squirrel to just run around and eat everything, destroy it all, and like. And
oh my
then,
God!
Wow.
Go or starve. So it's there's no easy fix for that. Anyway, so it's The Idiot. I'm at the beginning, but it's super fun.
That's
it.
been on my to read list for a while.
All right, well, I will
inspiring me.
pass you my copy.
Oh, thanks, Pamela.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.